welcome to you all. Tonight I want to talk about the prehistoric and the historic Indians. And I'm just wondering if any of you know the difference between prehistoric and historic. Is there a dividing date? Before written history is prehistory, and it depends on where you were in the world, obviously. Since you had writing in some of the Middle Eastern countries and that dates back from the 2, 3, 4,000 years before Christ. Prehistory ended there sooner than it did in North America and South America. So when we talk about the prehistoric Indians here, we're just talking about the ones that there were no written records that they kept. And it wasn't until other people came in who had a written language. In this particular area, in the Larimer County area, kind of the dividing line would be sometime in the mid to late 1700s, when we would divide up and people began coming in and recording what they had seen. The Native Americans in this area had no written language. And it wasn't until much, much later that we started searching and digging and so on, that they started finding the evidence of these people and recording it. So we have to refer to those people as prehistoric. The Native American people came to this area at the end of the last ice age, which would push it back to about 15,000 years ago. There's two theories. One is that there was enough water locked up in the glaciers that the level of the ocean dropped, and that narrow strait between Alaska and Russia, the Bering Strait, had exposed land, because there are islands there and there are points where it's close together. I think Sarah Palin said she could see Russia from her front porch or something. So I don't know if she could see the people walking across. So either way, it caused kind of a traffic jam. Probably sometime 15 to 20,000 years ago. And you had actually two-way traffic between the Asian part of Russia and what is now our Alaska. And you had Asian people then who migrated, who followed kind of the inter little valleys in that where the glaciers were not, and began to make their way south down this corridor, this kind of uniced area down, and some theories are that they continued clear down into southern South America. There's other theories that say those people came over by rafts or boats. You remember Thor Heyerdahl and his, he did Kon-Tiki, but then he had the other one where he built a reed boat and sailed from Africa to South America to say it was possible. So anyway, those were the people that came over. As they were coming this way, there were also animals coming this way, but there were also animals going the other way. The horse originally was on the North American continent. The little horse that was about the size of a puppy dog, called Eohippus. But the horse migrated to Asia, and then eventually over to Europe and so on, and then the Spaniards brought it back over here. So the horse got to make kind of a strange round trip. So anyway, those are just some of the theories of how people got to this area. Sometime between, I've seen dates of 9,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago, 11,000 years ago. These people found this kind of semi-tropical area, much moister than the land today. And they settled there and they hunted, and they found animals much larger than themselves. They found a bison. How many have been to Yellowstone and walked out to pet the bison? I actually saw some guy do that once up there. One guy with a camera and the other guy behind him, and he went out, put his hand up like this on the hump of the bull buffalo while the other guy took his picture, and I said, I wish that bison would just gore him. Stupid guy. But anyway, if you were going to do that to a modern bison, you could kind of put your hand out like this. If you were going to do it to the bison antiquus, you'd have to kind of go like that. So that was the difference in size. And they were a much larger animal, probably about half again as big as the modern bison. If you wanted a kitty cat for your family in those days, 12,000 years ago, then you would have looked around and went into the cave and brought out a little saber-toothed tiger kitty. You know, you probably brought out something else with you too, missing arms or legs. There were camels, smaller than the modern-day camel, and there were just these different animals 12,000 years ago. But the main thing they hunted was this bison antiquus. And do you know the difference between a buffalo and a bison? Someone asked an Englishman one time, he said, do you know the difference between a buffalo and a bison? He said, but of course, the buffalo is that rather shaggy beast out on the American prairies, and the bison is what you wash your face from. So, anyway, there are no buffalo in this part of the world. Africa, Europe, Asia, you have buffalo. In North America, you have the American bison. And they're not even related. They're not even in the same family. So to call them buffalo is okay, but to call them bison is more correct. So the ranch just across the border, south of Cheyenne, is the Terry Bison Ranch. And you have bison meatloaf and bison steaks and bison short ribs and so on. There were pronghorn, a little different variety than what we have today, but the bison seems to have been their main source of meat food. And then, you know, berries and nuts and roots. And again, when you got a wetter climate, you're going to have more vegetation. There's going to be more of those kinds of things available. So anyway, they settled on this area. Would have looked much different than this, up on the high plain of the Piedmont, as it's called. Over the years, you've had people settle up in this area. It's mostly ranch pasture land. It's really not good for much in the way of agriculture. You can do a little bit of hay farming up there, but not much else. But it's mostly an area as you get up near the border. And if you look north from Fort Collins, how many of you read Missioner's Centennial? A few of you. Remember the gangplank that he talked about? Yeah. Geographically, that's the Cheyenne Ridge, and that's the border between Colorado and Wyoming, and this land is right up on the south edge of the Cheyenne Ridge. And over the years, water and wind have created these rather deep arroyos up there. So this is from partway up the Cheyenne Ridge, looking out. I think this picture was looking to the southeast out onto the plains. As I said, this is known as the Colorado Piedmont, the very high plains. Over the years, since these people have been here, the wind has blown in a lot of soil. The water and wind have then eroded down into that soil. And I don't know how well you can see it, but over on the side there, you see that about 6 feet down, that mass of stone and black, right about left center of the screen? That's the remnants of an ancient fire pit that's been exposed by the erosion coming down the face of that. And there's lots of those up there in the various draws and so on. This is now the city soapstone natural area. Archaeologist Jason LaBelle from CSU and some of his students have been up there working now for the last 3 summers. And they have uncovered 100+ additional historic and prehistoric sites. So the one that we're going to talk about is not the only one there. These are the Coffin brothers, Judge Roy Coffin and Claude, thank you. Claude was the judge, okay, and then Roy was the geologist at the college, right? They went up in this area, and one description is that they literally went around on their hands and knees picking up Indian artifacts. They just collected them. They did record what they were getting. They kept good records, but they really didn't tell people about it. And if they had, the points, the one particular point style that they had found would have been known as the Lindenmeyer Point. But since they didn't report it, about 2-3 years after they started doing this, this was in the 1920s. In 1926, down in an arroyo down in New Mexico, there was a black cowboy, George Majunkin, riding down this arroyo as a dry gulch. And he looked over and he saw these large bones, these large rib bones. And wedged in between two of them was this point. And he had enough sense to bring somebody else out there, and they said, well, we've never seen one like that. So they got Professor Figgins from the Denver Museum of Natural History to come down there, and he said, well, this is one we haven't seen before. And since this was near Folsom, New Mexico, which is east of Raton, there in northeastern New Mexico, they named it, the cultural name for it then became the Folsom Point. And we already knew about the Clovis Point, which was found near Clovis, New Mexico, and the Sandia Point, and several others. So had they let somebody know, we would have had the cultural name for this area, because the ranch up there was the Lindenmeyer Ranch. And these are some of the areas where they dug down a little bit. You can see they exposed some bones sticking out. And here they are at work just in a little pit, working as amateur archaeologists. If you did that today, you would be fined. So it's illegal to do that. Of course, this is private land. Actually, on private land, you can do about whatever you want. But anyway, finally somebody said, well, we need to let somebody else who knows more about this know about it. So they did let the Smithsonian know, and starting in the mid-1930s, for I think it was 5 or 6 summers, they brought a Dr. Frank Roberts came out here, and he brought other people with him. He took people, most of them from the Aggies College, from what is now CSU, to go up there and from June into the middle of September to help excavating that area. So here's these arroyos today. They call the area soapstone. There is no soapstone up there. Soapstone is actually a type of stone, but this white kind of marly clay, when it gets wet, is very slick and slippery. And people said, boy, that's just like, the stone is just like soap. You're riding, like you're walking or driving on soap. So that's where the name soapstone for the area comes from. There have been groups that allowed up there. It's been under a private cattle company for, probably about the last 40 or 50 years, Soapstone Grazing Association. And this was a group in 1980. We got to go up there with a group from CSU, and we had an archaeologist who had done some work up there, Liz Morris, who was at CSU, and David Harris, who was a geologist over there, and 3 of the men who had worked on the site in the 30s. Bob Easterday and Jim Greenacre and I can't think of the third guy's name now. This is the way the Roberts and his guys had to get up there in those days, back in the 30s. And this is Mr. Roberts, Dr. Roberts, and his wife. His wife would come up and visit occasionally. I don't know why she didn't want to live up there in those tents and those. Bob Easterday said that in the summer when it was hot, they lived like the Folsom people. They just wore nothing but breech clouts. And then because they were so far back off the main roads, if any visitors were coming, they could see the plume of dust as the cars were approaching, so they could run and get their clothes. Unless some of the other guys hid their clothes. And then they had to hide behind a bush for however long the visitors were there. So, and they actually did that to him. Here's some of the crews that worked up there with him. Most of these were college students. I think that's Bob Easterday, second from the right, and I think Jim Greenacre's the third from the right next to him. And it was real interesting for them to talk about their experiences as college students working up there on this project. And here was their home for those 3 months that they were up there. This was, what does it say, 39? Yeah, this was 1939, the 39 camp. And down in the one big gulch, there's a spring that comes out, and they built a shower, a solar shower. See, they're way ahead of their time. They had fixed a thing up so the water came out of the spring, ran into this big canvas bucket or canvas kind of tub on top, and then the sun would heat it up. So when they wanted to it wasn't much of a shower, but they could rinse off at night at least. They had at least warm water. So, solar energy has been used for a long time around here. And that spring is down in the bottom of this. This is the major gulch that's right up there. And this is, again, right on that south edge of the Cheyenne Ridge, or the gangplank. I like Missioner's Gangplank. That's always, to me, has been a nice name for it. And their main cut was right in the center there. You see there kind of a big clump of bushes in that little side gulch. Their main cut was right up through there. They used horses and plows to kind of cut through, and then they went down and excavated down in that area. And then they made technical drawings to show you what the land looked like in that area. Here's kind of looking across the gulch from up a little higher. And that's the gulch today. Give you an idea of the size with the cattle there. And then here's one of their excavations up on top. And you can see how far they dug down. They said that each little group had I think it was a 10 feet by 10 feet square that they were responsible for, and they gridded it out and so on. And they had to mark when they found something exactly what depth it was and which part of the grid it was in. And here you can see them kind of digging into the various parts of it. But if you can imagine, you know how hot it gets in town in the summertime. So think of, August 1st, summertime, hot and dry. It's even hotter up there. But they did this, as I say, it was 5 or 6 summers' work that they did up there. Here's somebody sitting there. It looks like they're marking on the grid where they found something. But they found stone tools of all kinds. They found animal bones, mostly bison bones. They found skulls with the horns. They found no human remains. And that's always kind of a mystery, why some of these sites there's no human remain. They didn't really do anything much to bury the bodies. So, even the later Plains Indians, they really didn't use below ground burials. The Plains culture buried the dead on platforms up either in trees or just on platforms they would erect. And so over time, the corpses would just would decay away, and then the bones and everything would be carried off by predators. But you'd think at least teeth or parts of the skull. But no human remains were found in this area. And then the fire pits. And the charcoal, of course, was very useful in dating these finds. You can see they're down about 6 feet here. That guy's standing on a thing that's about 2 feet high, I think, of some of the dirt they haven't excavated yet. Slow process. This isn't picks and shovels and plows. This is hand tools and dental picks and little brushes and so on. But here's to make the major cut. They did use the horses and cut across that big thing just to cut down into the edge and top of the arroyo. And here's another one of their cuts. I imagine that they were pretty brown when they got through. The bottom layer would have taken them back to about 12,000 BP. We now say before the present. Used to say so many BC or years BC and so on. About 12,000 years is what they were able to date, particularly using the charcoal that they found. But they could also date from pieces of bone, because this wasn't yet fossilized. This wasn't fossilized bone. This was a seasonal camp, and they think they came in the fall and probably stayed here through the winter. And now you know what the winters are like now. So obviously the climate was different, and being on the south side of that ridge would give them some protection also. But it was definitely a wetter climate, probably I say semi-tropical, but it would be more temperate climate. How many of you have been up to the soapstone site? The city offers free tours. Probably will start again in May, and I don't know if it's this year they're supposed to open. In June, is it? But it's going to be very limited access. There will be horse trails and there will be hiking trails, but not much driving access. You're going to have to go in and then walk. But lots of interesting things up there. Today, if you fly over this area, you don't see the evidence. So they covered everything over. That line that you see on on the slide is where they had put an underground pipeline through. And that scar will be there for many, many, many years. So just to give you some idea, it's not like you can look down and say, oh, there was, where the camp was. It's down, it's buried. And the museum still has part of their exhibit on the Lindenmeyer side up, so that you can go in and see the artifacts and some things about it. So if you haven't been to see that, they had a really extensive exhibit about 3-4 years ago. All right, the historic Indians that came into this area, mainly Arapaho and Cheyenne, they did leave evidence, and because we're only talking about less than 200 years ago, a lot of that evidence is on the surface. Now, there were Indians from 12,000 up to the time of the Plains Indians. And there are places up by Livermore on the Roberts Ranch where they have excavated and they've gone down through various cultural levels. And in the Spring Gulch site, which is off of County Road 80E, they went down about, I think about 10 or 12 feet. And the last things that they found, they dated to about, I think it was 12 or 1300 BC. So about 3,300 years ago, as opposed to 12,000 years ago for these people. But there's a real gap in the record. So, but anyway, the Plains tribes that came through this area left evidence. And when I take groups of like fourth graders, or the main groups I take up here to see this, I always tell them, describe a little bit about the Native Americans. Say, go see if you can find any evidence of them. And these kids just go running across the pasture, and I hope they're making enough noise that the rattlesnakes are going that way. Only seen rattlesnakes up there 3 times, so that's not bad since 1966. But this is one of the teepee rings. And this one has a fire pit in the middle, and it's about 18 feet across. And that tells me that it wasn't a sleeping teepee, that it was a ceremonial teepee. The sleeping teepees were smaller. They didn't have the fire inside because they didn't want a fire popping and the sparks and embers, popping out and getting on their bison robes and their clothing and so on and burning holes in them. They cooked outside. But these were, they'd sit around these when they had ceremonies, and it was mostly for the men. But these are the stones that they would use to hold down the bottom of the teepee, their skin lodges, when the weather was cold. When it was hot, they'd roll the sides up. And so when they'd go to leave, they'd just roll the stones off and strip the hide covering off and take the poles and cross them. And by now they had horses, so they'd put them across the back of the horse and use some of those hides, the outer skin of these things. They'd kind of sling it in between, and they'd carry the kids and the supplies and so on. And these were called travois. They were like wagons without wheels. They were just two poles that were dragged behind the horse. So up in starting over by the Larimer County landfill, along the foothills there, up around Bellevue and LaPorte, up Livermore area and so on the Roberts Ranch, there's lots of evidence of these places where they would have stayed. You can see the difference in size. See how much smaller this one is? And there's about a half a dozen of these up about a quarter mile above those other teepee rings that I showed you that are near where the Overland Trail went through. And my theory is that this is where the warrior society, who didn't want to be with the rest of the tribe, but were supposed to guard them, so they were up higher and isolated from the tribe. And there's about 6 to 8 teepee rings up here. And I think it's my theory that that's where the warrior society set up their little village. And there's rock outcroppings there, and they could see for miles from there. And there's one of those smaller ones. No fire pit in the middle. So these Indians did not have the fire pits. The other thing that they did, the earlier Native Americans that were up in this area before the Arapaho, before the Cheyenne, some of the cultural anthropologists and the archaeologists called them Woodland People. because they're more similar to the people who would come out of the woodland areas up in the Midwest. But these people didn't have horses, because the Indians didn't get horses until about the third wave of Spaniards came in. Because when the conquistadors came over, they brought horses, but they only brought the male ones. Because if you were a warrior with all that armor on, you weren't going to ride a mare. So they didn't bring breeding stock. And it wasn't until they started bringing the families that they had brought the mares and so on. So these Native Americans that the earlier ones did not have horses, so in order to hunt, these now were into the modern bison, they had to run them down on foot. This is a cliff on the Roberts Ranch, and at the base of the cliff, there's this big pile, a great big pile of bison bones, and they call this a buffalo jump. And one time we had a tour up there, and somebody said, "Are we going to get to watch the buffalo jump up and down?" I said, no, not that kind of buffalo jump. So, but anyway, this is what it looks like from the alfalfa field looking toward the cliff. They ran them off the top and down. The North Fork of the Cashlaputer is right there. And these are the animals that we're talking about. These are the modern, the American bison, much smaller than the ancient bison. And this is what it looks like from the top. And you can see there's kind of a little natural kind of U here. And as you're looking down or looking across this, it looks like it just goes right down and right into the field. And the bison are nearsighted animals, and once they start stampeding, they usually don't stop. And so they would get them, a small group of them, stampeding down this little concave valley, and as they were running, all of a sudden went straight down about 60, 70 feet. And by that time, it's kind of like trying to stop your car if it's going over the edge. Good luck. Plus the ones behind them are pushing them, and so they started dropping over the edge down to the river bottom. And down at the lower part of the picture is this big pile of, now it's dirt and bison bones. And I took my nephew up there one time. I looked across the river, and the river was low. It was like probably September, and I could see a rib bone sticking up out of the dirt. So I told Mike, I said, take your shoes and socks off and wade over there and get yourself a real, a bison bone that the Indians would have butchered. He went over there and he was kind of pawing around the dirt. He came back, he had 2 rib bones and a jawbone, just right virtually on the surface. So the thing is just filled with it. It has been excavated and filled back in and evaluated, and there are reports on it. But that would be the drop for these bison. There's a hawk's nest, permanent hawk's nest on the side of that. There's cliff swallow nests. Off to the right is that pile of dirt and bison bones of all different sizes. I brought my friend with me tonight in case I said anything wrong. Do any of you know him? Some of you kids should know him from 2nd grade. This is an Arapaho. They call him a chief, but he was the head of a small band that lived in this area. And I can't pronounce his Indian name. I've seen it written, but it's kind of unpronounceable since I don't speak Arapaho. But he was a Native American who got separated from his tribe when he was about 12 years old. And he was found by an Indian agent whose last name was Fitzpatrick. And Fitzpatrick, according to legend, said, well, I found him on a Friday, so I'll call him Friday. Now the alternate story to that is that Fitzpatrick knew the story of Robinson Crusoe, and that he just used the same name that Robinson Crusoe did for his man Friday. So, they're both good stories. You can take your pick. He sent this young Indian back to St. Louis and had him put in the schools back there. And he learned to read, write, and speak English very, very well. And then when he was in his later teens, he came back out and eventually was able to link up with his own people, his own family. And because he was so well versed in the English language, he became a leader. And in our culture, anybody who's a leader, we call him a chief. So So this is Chief Friday. And when some of the settlers came in, he welcomed them with open arms and said, yes, come in. We can live together in peace. Now, you know how they thanked him? He said, hey, pack up your family, pack up all your stuff, go up to central Wyoming and live with your enemy, the Shoshone, on the Wind River Reservation. Didn't say thank you. They said, bye-bye. So anyway, this is my buddy Chief Friday. I want to read you an Indian legend. You all know what Horsetooth Rock looks like? It's a rock that sticks up on the ridge that has these cuts in it. And apparently somebody, some Anglo settler came out here and said, gee, that looks like a horse's tooth. Well, the Native Americans didn't think so. And Hugo Yvonne Fry, who was raised up in the valley where Horsetooth Reservoir is now, near the little quarry town of Stout. Thing is irritating. He wrote this story, and he said that when the Indians were here by themselves, they called it the Valley of Contentment. And they found it as a place where it was kind of a peaceful place, and it said the children's voices would be heard musically and clear, echoing up and down the glade. Buffalo, deer, and antelope roamed the grass-filled valley, scolded by innumerable prairie dogs chirping saucily from their rounded mounds. For centuries, the Valley of Contentment was the summer retreat for the Indians, and they looked forward to returning to it each year. Standing guard over the valley was a huge cleft mountain whose precipitous sides were a challenge to the daring climbers. And it was here, according to the Indian legend, a powerful giant made his home and defied any earthly being to come within his domain. But it became known that this giant, in his sleep, when the full moon was out, would expose his heart. It would beat out of his chest. Wrong side. As he laid down. And he had a huge nighthawk who flew over and guarded the valley. And if one of these Indians would come into the valley, the nighthawk would screech, and he'd get up and he'd get this big tomahawk and kill him. So it says, the Indians called upon their most powerful chief to lead them against the giant. When Chief Maunanumoku learned of the moonlight vigil of the nighthawk, he determined to lure the bird away with the aid of a large white rabbit. He tied him outside the valley, and when the nighthawk flew to find out where the struggling animal was, he then steadily approached the sleeping giant. He could see the heart beating up out of the chest, and so he reached up into the sky, pulled out a tomahawk of stars, star-encrusted tomahawk, and with a mighty stroke, right into the heart of the sleeping giant. And the sleeping giant started to get up. And so he went second time. And the giant fell back, and the blood was gushing out, and he died, and his body turned to stone, and his heart turned to stone with the two cuts in it. And the red blood went down the side of the rocks and turned them all red. And now we have beautiful red sandstone in our buildings around town that were built of the stone that came out of there. And so now the Indians could go back into the Valley of Contentment and do their hunting. So that's actually not a horse's tooth up there. That's actually the wounded heart, the fatally wounded heart of this sleeping giant. And I believe that story.